By the early 1930s, Greta Garbo had become the biggest movie star in Hollywood. Here she can be seen starring as Mata Hari in 1931, which became MGM's biggest box office hit of that year. It also became the highest grossing film of her career. Mata Hari is very much a star vehicle. The film is built around Greta Garbo. The camera worships her in one close-up after another. This was the peak of her career. Widely considered to be the most glamorous woman in the world, there was naturally a lot of speculation about her love life. Her most notable love affair was with her co-star John Gilbert, but that relationship didn't last. Whilst filming Mata Hari, she had embarked on her latest affair, only this time it was with another woman, Mercedes de Acosta, novelist, poet, playwright, a woman referred to by Cecil Beaton as that furious lesbian. People have been speculating about Greta Garbo's sexuality for decades now. All of her biographers are forced to do a kind of was she, wasn't she dance in relation to her sexuality. What we can say for certain is this: Garbo never married, she never had children, and she never settled into a long-term relationship. But we can also say for certain that she didn't die a virgin. Just watch any of her films and you will see. Greta Garbo was a deeply sensual woman. She was not asexual. In this 3-part documentary, we'll explore her career, her personality, and her relationship with Mercedes de Acosta. Before we begin, let's look at a clip of her in action from one of my favourite scenes in Mata Hari, where she asks her lover to perform an act of sacrilege for her own amusement.
Put out that one too.
The Madonna's lamp?
Yes.
I couldn't do that.
You said I came first.
But don't you understand that it's a holy lamp? That I swore to keep it burning?
You wouldn't do that for me?
Why? Why do you ask me to?
See if you love me, as you say.
I do, Matt, I do.
Well, then put it out. If you love me.
I'll do anything, but please don't ask me to do that.
I'm going.
No. Forgive me.
The youngest of 3 siblings, she was born Greta Lovisa Gustafsson on the 18th of September 1905 in one of the poorest districts in Stockholm. Her father Carl was an unskilled labourer. Garbo inherited her big melancholy eyes from him. Her mother Anna was a homemaker who sometimes worked in a jam factory. From a young age, Greta had one ambition. She wanted to be an actress. The theatre represented an escape from her humdrum existence. Her older sister Alva and her older brother Sven also developed theatrical ambitions. The Gustafssons were a poor but not impoverished family. They were tight-knit and relatively happy. But that would change quite suddenly when Carl, Greta's father, was struck down by kidney disease. His health deteriorated so rapidly, Greta was forced to drop out of school and care for him. Her elder siblings and mother went out to work. When he was 48 and Greta just 14, he passed away. Following the death of her father, Greta was unable to complete her education. The family was so poor, she was forced to go to work. She got her first job in a barber's shop as a soap girl. It was her job to lather the faces of men with soap before the barber would then shave them. You can imagine how unpleasant this job would have been for a teenage girl, and so she didn't last long. She wanted to find something more suitable, and so she got herself a job at PUB. This was Sweden's main department store at that time. Greta worked in the ladies' clothing department as a shop assistant. Her manager described her as conscientious, quiet, and hard-working. But deep down, Greta had big ambitions. Only, how was a poor shop assistant from Sweden supposed to become a star? In an unlikely turn of events, the department store, PUB, would prove to be the springboard to her theatrical career. The store manager needed someone to model hats. Young aspiring actress Greta put herself forward and got the gig. She did her first modelling job, it went well, she did more, and then she got the opportunity to appear in PUB's first filmed commercials. That's her in the fur coat. You can see her modelling various outfits in her first ever on-screen appearance. This was a perhaps inauspicious start to her career. Garbo looks fine. She looks like a perfectly nice young lady. But does she look like she's about to become the most glamorous film star in the world? Probably not. This footage is easy to track down now because we have YouTube, but in Garbo's day, it was difficult to find. Orson Welles, however, was given a private screening many years later after she had become world famous, and he got to see Garbo's first ever on-screen appearances, and this was his assessment.
When you talked to me last time, you said something about, I think your friend Akim Tamirov said about acting, either the camera loves you or the camera doesn't. I presume that was true, more true about Garbo than anybody else, wasn't it?
Yes, I suppose that anybody. And of course, it's a great mystery. I don't know if you've ever seen those commercials she did.
No.
When I went to Stockholm years ago, they showed me in their film institute there 2 commercials for bread that she made to be shown in movie theaters. And there was this great galumphing Swedish cow having a picnic. There was nothing to show you that you were looking at the most divine creature would ever be on the screen. And 2 years later, she was Greta Garbo. Now, I have no explanation whatsoever for that.
A galumphing Swedish cow. Ouch. Anyhow, thanks Orson. By now, Greta's ambitions were outgrowing the department store, and so she auditioned for Sweden's most prestigious drama school, the Royal Dramatic Training Academy. She got in, and the next stage of her life began. At drama school, Greta would develop her first crush, the first that we know about anyway, with fellow student Mimi Polak. Look at this photo. These are all the students from Garbo's year, and they're all staring into the camera. But Garbo is staring at her friend, Mimi. And here she can be seen in a slightly more playful mood. Some guy's got his hand around her throat for some reason, and trusty Mimi is standing next to her. Mimi Polak is the only person Greta poured her heart out to in letters and telegrams. By the time Garbo became famous, she was far more cautious in terms of what she would write, because obviously it could end up in the press. So here's an early letter from 1924. Garbo's obviously writing in response to something Mimi has sent her. She says this: "The letter from you has aroused a storm of longing within me." Some years later, when Mimi married, Garbo wrote to congratulate her and urged her not to forget your old bachelor. I love you, little mimosa. When Mimi announced she was pregnant, Garbo wrote what can only be read as a coming out letter. We cannot help our nature as God has created it, but I have always thought you and I belonged together. When Mimi gave birth to her son, Garbo wrote again to tell her that she was, quote, proud to be a father. The romantic part of their relationship appears to have been one-sided. There's no evidence to suggest that they had an affair. Mimi's side of the story remains obscure, as Garbo's heirs have so far refused to release Mimi's letters to Garbo. Mimi understood Garbo as well as anyone and clearly wasn't put off by her nature or bachelor lifestyle. Mimi went on to become a successful actress and theatre director in Sweden. She rarely spoke about her old bachelor friend after she became world famous, and when she did, she spoke in general terms about what a good actress she was, etc. Whatever Garbo secrets Mimi possessed, she took to the grave with her. She remained one of, if not her most loyal friend. The same cannot be said for Garbo's future lovers. Before we move on, I wanted to show you this. On the left is a picture of Mercedes de Acosta, and on the right is Mimi Polak. They look the double of each other. Mercedes was born in New York in 1892. She grew up in a large house on West 47th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues. Her neighbours included Theodore Roosevelt and the Vanderbilts. Her upbringing was a world away from Garbo's. And here's a picture of Mercedes' parents. Her mother, Michaela Hernandez, a Spanish heiress with a multi-million-dollar fortune, and her husband, Ricardo de Acosta, a well-paid shipping executive. He looks a little bit like Arthur Rimbaud. Mercedes' most notable sibling was her elder sister, Rita, considered to be one of the most beautiful young women in New York high society. When she was married in 1895, she made headlines in the New York Times. The Times reported thus: "No wedding this season in New York has attracted more interest among society people generally than the marriage of Miss Rita Hernandez de Alba Acosta to William Earl Dodge Stokes, which took place at noon yesterday at the home of the bride." In 1903, Mercedes' other sister, Ada de Acosta, became the first woman to fly a motorized aircraft. And you can see her there in that picture, flying, 6 months before the Wright brothers took off for their first flight. It's safe to say the Acostas were a high-achieving family. Mercedes had a lot to live up to. Her impossibly glamorous sister Rita would prove to be the formative influence on the young Mercedes. She took her on vacations to Paris, where they would attend private parties with the great French actress Sarah Bernhardt, the biggest drama queen of them all, and they would watch her performing monologues from her plays. Rita also took Mercedes to the studio of the great sculptor Auguste Rodin, and she would watch her sister pose for him. Mercedes was clearly influenced by the artists she met. She read widely and had ambitions of becoming a writer herself. She began to write poetry and plays. But she also began to cultivate a public image. She wore only black or white. Sometimes she wore long black capes and black buckled shoes like some kind of 18th century swashbuckling pirate or something. Many years later, Tallulah Bankhead would refer to Mercedes as Dracula. She was also a lifelong feminist, and so inevitably she became a suffragette, and here you can see her campaigning for women's suffrage. Mercedes was socially ambitious. She befriended Elizabeth Marbury, a filthy rich theatrical agent who lived openly in a lesbian relationship with her partner, Elsie de Wolfe. And here you can see Elsie in her later years, and yes, she was incredibly glamorous. Elsie tried her hand at being an actress, but didn't get too far with that, and so, at the behest of her partner, Elizabeth, she decided to invent a new profession: interior designer. Yes, she became America's first ever interior designer. Mercedes, a young, charismatic lesbian with theatrical ambitions, clearly charmed Elsie and Elizabeth, and so they took her under their wing and introduced her to some of the most notable leading ladies of the time. Mercedes was on her way to becoming the female Casanova. She allegedly boasted, "I can get any woman off any man." It became her most famous line, rather like Garbo's "I want to be alone." It's doubtful whether or not Mercedes actually said that line, but nonetheless, it has stuck to her, and it stuck to her for a reason. Her body count is truly extraordinary. And here you can see the first of Mercedes' many famous female lovers, the great Russian actress Alena Azimova, starring as Camille, a role later immortalized by Greta Garbo herself. She's starring alongside Rudolph Valentino. Mercedes was probably Alena Azimova's first female lover. Nazimova went on to become a key figure in Sapphic Hollywood. She was one of the highest paid actresses of her time, but she was unsatisfied with the roles she was being offered, and so she began to invest huge sums of her own money into her own films, essentially directing and producing her own movies, arguably becoming Hollywood's first female auteur. In 1923, Nazimova invested a fortune in her film Salome. She was determined to make an adaptation of Oscar Wilde's notorious play. He had been jailed for gross indecency back in 1895, and so in 1923, the Oscar Wilde scandal was still relatively fresh in people's minds, and the things he'd been accused of were still considered to be hugely controversial. Oscar Wilde's plays would have been perfect fodder for silent cinema, but there aren't too many silent movies based on his works, for the very simple reason that he was still a very controversial figure. Nazimova was taking a risk investing so much money into this project. According to Hollywood legend, she employed an all-gay cast in tribute to dear old Oscar in her Salome production. This is a cute story, but unfortunately it's not true. There were nonetheless plenty of gay people in this film. It's well worth watching now. I mean, I can't quite say it's a lost classic, but it certainly has some striking moments. Unfortunately, the film was a massive flop, and Nazimova was financially ruined. Nazimova's romantic relationship with Mercedes eventually fizzled out. They nonetheless remained lifelong friends, and here's a signed photograph from Nazimova to Mercedes. It reads, "To Mercedes, Alla." Oh, and as a quick aside, I couldn't help but point out that Alla Nazimova's Salome look looks a lot like Lady Gaga's Fame Monster. As Nazimova was making her doomed Salome film, Mercedes was staging one of her own plays at the Provincetown Theatre. Sandro Botticelli tells the story of the great painter and his relationship with his muse, Simonetta Vespucci. The play starred Mercedes' latest lover, actress Eva Le Galienne. Mercedes had wasted no time in moving on from Nazimova. As a matter of fact, Eva Le Galienne had had a brief fling with Nazimova. So, yes, the Sapphic theatre world was quite small, and people played musical chairs with each other, so to speak. The play explores the inspiration behind Botticelli's great painting, The Birth of Venus. Now, as you can see, Botticelli's muse, Simonetta Vespucci, posed for him nude, her hair covering her modesty somewhat. So in this play, Mercedes will be given the opportunity to depict her new girlfriend on stage in the nude. I wonder why she chose this topic. And here's a photograph from that production. There you can see Eva Le Galienne playing Simonetta Vespucci. Now, clearly they couldn't depict her on stage actually naked back in the 1920s, even in Provincetown. The big reveal was due to take place in Act 2, so during the intermission, theatregoers were very curious, chattering amongst themselves, wondering how they might depict the nude scene. So, quite simply, Eva Le Galienne dropped her robe, her long hair came cascading down, and a well-placed chair preserved her modesty. Despite playing to a packed house in Provincetown and all the excitement of the nude scene, the play was mauled by the critics. One critic referred to Mercedes as, quote, "a yearning society amateur." Her writing style was described thus: "so floral, at times, that it is reminiscent of a seed catalogue. Ouch." Mercedes' play may have been a flop, but her relationship with Eva Le Galienne continued. And before we proceed to the next stage in her life, we need to take a step back, because 3 years prior to this play, Mercedes had made a big life decision. She'd gotten married to a man, Abraham Poole, a sculptor and painter. Now, this marriage was actually not so surprising. Mercedes came from a good family, and the expectation was that a nice young society girl like her would get married. It was just what you did in those days. Her marriage made the papers. The Evening World reported thus: Miss de Acosta, one of the favourites of society, as well as a most handsome and attractive young woman of the Spanish type, is a talented poet, writer, and playwright. The article goes on to praise her new husband's wartime record and his credentials as a painter. So there you have it. Mercedes had bagged herself a handsome and wealthy World War I veteran. Like her, he was also an artist. Abraham would have been quite a catch, but he just so happened to have been caught by the furious lesbian herself. According to Abraham's son from his second marriage, his marriage with Mercedes was never consummated, despite the fact that they were together for 15 years. She openly dated women, and he appears to have faded into the background and accepted his fate. I think the expression on his face says it all. Whilst on vacation with his wife in Paris, Abraham had to put up with a surprise guest, Mercedes' latest girlfriend, star of Sandro Botticelli, Eva Le Galienne. Abraham knew the score. He would make himself scarce, whilst his wife and her new lover would explore Paris and each other. The tone of their letters will give you a sense of how passionate their relationship was. Eva wrote, "I love you insanely." In a separate letter, she wrote, "I think you will simply have to marry me in order to keep me alive. My longing for you is like a madness." Mercedes also wrote gushing love letters to Eva. She also wrote poetry in which she adopted a more ambivalent tone. Here's one of the better love poems she wrote while she was dating Eva. It's called Unpossessed. Never shall I be subdued, nor the real secret of me understood. Passionately and violently my body may be possessed, but my spirit, always a virgin, will wander on forever, unpossessed. Mercedes had a plan. She would write a new play based on the life of Joan of Arc. Eva would take the starring role, and hopefully their passion for each other would translate into theatrical success. Whilst in Paris, they took a trip to Rouen to see where Joan of Arc had been burned. Eva Le Gallienne's career as an actress went from strength to strength, but Mercedes' writing career had stalled. Eva was determined to give Mercedes another chance, and so she leveraged her contacts in the industry to bring Mercedes' latest play to the stage. She enlisted Norman Bell Geddes to design and direct the play. He went on to become one of America's great theatre and industrial designers. The New York Times likened him to a 20th century Leonardo da Vinci. This was going to be the biggest production of Mercedes' career thus far. The play would be staged at the Odeon Theatre in Paris. Eva Le Galienne had spent part of her childhood in Paris, and so she spoke fluent French. She translated Mercedes' English text of Joan of Arc into French. Neither Mercedes nor the director of the play spoke a word of French, which may have been an early warning sign. And here you can see one of Geddes' sketches for the play. His vision was incredibly ambitious and the budget was considerable. However, things started to go wrong quite quickly. The sets he designed were too big for the Odeon Theatre, and so at great cost they had to move to the Theatre Porte Saint-Martin. It cost them about $6 or $7 grand to rent that theatre, which was a lot of money in the 1920s. The play included over 150 extras, many of them Russian émigrés who didn't speak English or French. Geddes was trying to direct the French cast in English and broken French. At one point, one of the actors thought she'd been referred to as a pig, but he hadn't called her a pig, he just mispronounced her name in his hopelessly bad French. She almost mutinied, and it was all turning into a bit of a disaster. Mercedes' nerves were no doubt frayed, and by opening night there was a huge amount of excitement. Everybody was there. Cole Porter, Ivor Novello, Dorothy Parker, Noel Coward. Joan of Arc was turning into quite the spectacle. And there's a photograph of Eva Le Galienne on stage as Joan of Arc in Mercedes' play. Now, Eva had gone into this production with mixed feelings. Deep down, she didn't think Mercedes' text was really that good, and neither did the director. That probably explains why they relied on spectacle to make the show a success. Now, the general consensus among theatre historians is that Mercedes' Joan of Arc play in Paris was a total flop. But if you read reviews from the time, they actually weren't that bad. This is the New York Times review from opening night. Eva Le Gallienne's performance was singled out for praise, although Mercedes' dialogue was referred to as, quote, relatively unimportant. Getty's set designs were also given praise. The New York Daily News took a similar view. Le Gallienne's performance was given praise, as were Getty's sets. However, Mercedes' writing received no praise. The middling reviews were survivable, however, the production had become a financial disaster. What with all the extras and the elaborate sets and having to rent a different theatre, there was no way the play was going to transfer to New York as Mercedes had hoped. And so, with another failure under her belt, Mercedes and Eva Le Galienne sailed back home. They sailed in style on the RMS Majestic, which was the largest ship in the world at that time, a ship comparable to the Titanic in terms of its sheer grandeur, and on board were some very interesting fellow travellers, including Noel Coward and his entourage. Set designer Gladys Calthrop was travelling with Noel Coward, and she would soon begin an affair with Eva Le Galienne. The failure of the Joan of Arc production essentially ended Eva and Mercedes' relationship. They'd had 2 failed plays by now, so it was just too much. Eva was very ambitious, and she wanted to associate with people who could elevate her career rather than drag it down. Mercedes was heartbroken by the failure of her play and the demise of her relationship with Eva. Her mood was pretty bleak as they sailed back home. It isn't actually clear if Ava's relationship with Gladys began while they were sailing. If it had, that would have been incredibly painful for Mercedes to observe. But Mercedes would get a strange kind of revenge when she would steal Gladys from Ava. Yes, as we've established, the Sapphic theatre world was quite small, and the games of musical chairs continued. Mercedes' fling with Gladys Calthrop would put her back in the news agenda in 2024 when a previously unknown volume of Mercedes' poems came to the attention of a rare book dealer in London. And here you can see the stunningly bound gold volume of manuscript poems, all handwritten by Mercedes, and most of these poems were unknown prior to this book being discovered this year. All of the poems are dedicated to Gladys. The emergence of this really quite stunning volume makes you wonder what other Mercedes de Acosta treasures could be hiding out there, chronicling her relationships with some of the 20th century's most notable women. And so to wrap up part 1, let's take a trip back to Sweden and catch up with Greta Garbo. If you've seen any of the famous adaptations of A Star is Born, whether it's the Garland one, the Streisand one, or the Lady Gaga one, you'll have a sense of the kind of relationship Greta Garbo had with director Moritz Stiller. He plucked her from obscurity and turned her into a star. It's a timeless story, and that's why it's been retold so many times on the big screen. A Star is Born is really a fairy tale, and as with so many fairy tales, it ends in tragedy. The apprentice star, whether it's Streisand or Lady Gaga, eventually eclipses the established star. So the pupil eclipses the mentor. And that is exactly what happened with Garbo and Stiller. Now, in the movies, there is a romantic entanglement involved because, obviously it's a Hollywood film, you need a love story. That wasn't the case with Greta and Stiller because he was gay, so he wasn't interested in her in that sense. Stiller is the only person who ever managed to dominate Greta Garbo. She was a fiercely independent person, incredibly stubborn. He's really the only person who molded her, and I think later in life she would have liked somebody who could have dominated her in a sense, but she didn't really find anyone who was equal to the task. Stiller took full control of her career, her image, and her finances. He also changed her name. Greta Gustafsson was far too Swedish sounding. He needed something that would appeal to international audiences, and so he renamed her Greta Garbo. 4 syllables, easy to pronounce. Greta and Stiller made 2 films in Europe. They then sailed to America to try their luck in Hollywood, not speaking a word of English between them. In part 2, we'll explore Greta Garbo's meteoric rise to stardom and her relationship with Mercedes de Acosta.